Landlording is simple, but it isn't easy. The 3 keys I'm going to share with you today help even seasoned landlords from burning out, getting sued, or simply bleeding money. Let's get started. Quick question before we jump in. Is there some landlording mistake that you wish before you ever got started that someone had warned you about? If so, share it in the comments. The first key to landlording success has to do with you figuring out whether you can imagine what your ideal tenant looks like. And this is something you need to know well before any tenant ever even applies to stay on your property. You gotta ask yourself, if I had to write things down, could I articulate clearly the kinds of things that I want to see in a tenant? By understanding the kind of tenant that you're after, the kind of tenant that would be ideal for your situation, you're gonna likely find that great fitting tenant. You know your house or your condominium or your townhome, and so who would best be suited for the kind of rental that you are presenting? Maybe you live in a college town and you're really only renting out a single room. In your mind, you should have, before you ever get started, the parameters of what make your ideal tenant. Now, certainly you want to be aware of the kinds of things that you simply can't use as a barrier. And certainly you don't want to say any of the federally protective classes need not apply. That's not what we're talking about here. Instead, what we're talking about are the kinds of qualities that your tenant should possess before they ever sign the lease. Maybe you want someone who's been employed with the same employer for 3 years. And in your mind, this establishes a good benchmark for someone who will reliably stay in place. Someone who jumps from city to city or job to job maybe doesn't have the stability that you are looking for in your ideal tenant. Additionally, you may have a credit score in mind, and there is no absolute when it comes to this, but you do have to have a benchmark. You can't just say everyone is welcome, because not everyone will be a good fit. Keep in mind also that someone who can't prove the kind of rental history they've had in the past, or maybe someone who's never had rental history, is going to be a gamble for you, and you may have a baseline that requires that any incoming tenant has an outgoing reference that's positive. By figuring out beforehand the qualities of an ideal tenant, you know what to look for in each of your applicants. In fact, you can prepare them by setting out an absolute list of the kinds of things you're looking for in terms of things like credit score, rental history, work history, and the like. But what sorts of things have worked for other landlords? That's a question you absolutely need to ask. And you ask that of other landlords. What sorts of things have worked out for them? What sorts of things have failed for them? What sorts of things do they look out for in an ideal tenant for themselves? And it may not be a perfect match, but it might be something that helps you as you formulate your ideal tenant. Again, all of this is done before a lease is ever signed, and it puts you in a position for absolute success right from the beginning. For those of you who've been doing this for a while, what sort of red flag is out there that you spot now instantly that you didn't before, a lesson you learned the hard way? The next key to success for landlording is to practice consistent enforcement of your lease terms. And in order to do this the absolute best, you really should get ahead of any default before that lease is signed. This is something that I recommend to all landlords, whether you've done this for 30 years or you've got your first one lined up. Before you actually sign a lease, before you actually take a single dollar or hand over those keys, you should sit down with the tenant and explain the key provisions of your lease and how you mean to enforce those provisions. When a tenant knows that rent is due on or before the first of the month and that you're serious about that, they're likelier to comply, as opposed to them having a generalized idea that you'll take the rent anytime within the first week. By making it absolutely clear that late payment will be met with some kind of written notice, you're setting your tenant up for success and thereby setting yourself up for success as well. However, in order to do this professionally, You need to take on a professional attitude when it comes to your lease, which means you need to know that lease forward and backward. There are a lot of landlords who come to me and say, Ernie, I had no idea that I had the right to do this or that my tenant was obligated to do that. What's the most unfortunate is in many of these situations, we have landlords who simply didn't know that they could do the thing that they wanted to do. One very common instance of this has to do with inspections. I had a tenant once who told me that there was a strange thing going on in their duplex. They had one unit that was occupied and the other unit was newly refurbished. And the occupied unit was due for some upgrades, but they had a tenant there that they acquired when they purchased this duplex. So this wasn't somebody they put in place, it was someone they took on. And while they got a hold of their lease, they had not studied it very well. To them, the most important aspect of it was the rent. And the tenant was great about paying rent on time. But what these landlords didn't do was they didn't enforce the inspection provision in their lease just to go in and check out what it was. In fact, they bought the property with one occupied unit and one empty unit and simply trusted the word of the landlord that everything was going fine next door. It wasn't until after refurbishing the empty unit that they found that every other day something was wrong. Things were torn up, there was trash where it didn't belong, cabinets were opened, and there were distinct smells in that unit that just didn't make sense. They found something very weird. The occupant not only was a terrible hoarder, boxes and old stuff from years of collecting stacked floor to ceiling. You couldn't actually get through the unit because there was so much stuff. What they also found was that this particular occupant had a habit of feeding the neighborhood raccoons. He would leave food outside and in fact had a number of raccoons residing in the unit. Those same raccoons, I guess when things got too crowded there, would simply hop over to the adjoining unit and party it up because they had a wide open space that had just been refurbished by the landlord. Had they never inspected that unit, they never would have found the source of their pest problem, nor would they have been able to deal with it adequately because the occupant next door was simply enabling these raccoons to come in and do whatever they wanted. What a mess. But by knowing ahead of time the provisions in your lease, you know how to enforce them. You don't have to wait for permission. You can simply act. And when it comes to the lease, you need to know where your limits lie and the limits of the occupant. If your tenant is saying, no, I don't want you to come in, or I've changed the locks because I don't feel safe, what does your lease already say about your ability to enter and inspect your property? What does your lease say about your right to charge late fees? What does your state law require in terms of an upper limit? Does your state actually have a limit? And if they do have a limit, do you know what it is? And do you know the consequences of charging beyond that limit? In the state of Texas, for example, when you have a single family home, you are limited in late fees to a 12% fee. That means if your rent for a given month is $1,000, the maximum that you can charge for late fees is $120. I've seen landlords go well beyond this and then show me a ledger when they seek to evict. And once I do the math, real trouble comes up because it turns out if you apply all of the overcharges, you no longer have a delinquency. In fact, in certain cases, the landlord actually owes money back to the tenant. And there are stiff penalties in the state of Texas for charging a tenant more than that actual limit. By not understanding these limits and what the law has to say about it, you put yourself at risk, but then you also deny yourself certain rights because you don't know the bright line that exists for your tenant. Don't let the tenant just push you around or quote the law as though they are an expert. If you simply are not sure and you can't figure it out from your lease, definitely seek out a landlord-tenant attorney and ask these questions. Where are the boundaries in the law? And help me understand the boundaries in my lease so that I can better enforce them. What's one clause in your lease that you know now that you wish you had enforced from the very beginning? And the final key for good landlording has to do with getting rid of substandard tenants sooner rather than later. It's important for you to understand early on in the process that your tenants are going to breach. It happens all the time to varying degrees. So the fact that they're going to breach doesn't necessarily mean you instantaneously have to get rid of every tenant that breaches any small provision of your lease. But you need to know what to do once breach happens. If you're simply turning a blind eye, if you're saying, well, I'm going to let that slide, you might be setting yourself up for failure. But to set yourself up for success, it's important not just to understand that they're going to breach, but have a plan in place for once that breach occurs. Simply put, you need to respond to each breach quickly, firmly, and in writing. The fact that you get onto them on the telephone or that you go and you have a real stern talking with them is probably not going to be good enough. I have lots of landlords who come to me and say, Ernie, I have had it with this tenant. Every single month, I go over there and I give them a piece of my mind for turning rent in late. But they still don't listen. Well, it might be because of the method that you're getting your point across and the fact that it's just not effective. If the behavior isn't changing by what you're doing, it might be because what you're doing isn't right. What I recommend always is for whatever breach, except for non-payment, if you've got an issue of non-payment of rent, you can jump straight to a notice to vacate. That's the way it works in Texas, and that's the way it works in most jurisdictions. You don't need to give forewarning in most cases. Make sure you know what the situation is in yours. But generally speaking, non-payment of rent is the big one. You can issue that notice to vacate, but I would do it early in the process. Don't let 4 weeks drag on. Don't let 3 months drag on before you act. Understand when you're going to do it and do it. However, there are other breaches of the lease that I wouldn't recommend that you issue a notice to vacate upon a first violation. For example, if someone simply isn't cutting their grass and you get a letter from the homeowners association saying, hey, you're supposed to cut your grass regularly and your tenant isn't doing it, you're currently in violation. Now, you haven't been issued a fee, but you did get a letter. And so this is a good opportunity for you to practice your notice of default. And you send that notice in writing to your tenant saying, look, your lease requires that you follow the homeowners association rules, or simply your lease requires that you cut the grass once every week, once every other week, whatever it is that are in your rules, whether it's homeowners association or just your lease itself, know how to enforce it in writing. Be quick, be firm, and be in written format every time it happens. And again, you don't have to say you violated the lease once and now you got to go. But you should say repeated violations of the lease could result in a notice to vacate and ultimately in an eviction. You're not being abusive to remind your tenant what the rules of the lease are, nor is it such a bad thing to hold them to the promises that they made when they signed your lease. So hand over that written notice and watch and wait and see what they do. A good tenant is going to respond positively. They're going to get the job done. And maybe it's not something you covered before the lease began, but now that you're calling them on it, they'll take care of it from here on out. Great. But a bad tenant isn't going to respond positively at all. In fact, a bad tenant may become defensive and they may dig their heels in and just get worse. That's where another notice and possibly a third notice are necessary in order to correct the behavior. But if that behavior isn't corrected after a third notice, we call that strike 3 and that tenant has got to go out. For you, what's the longest you've ever held on to a bad tenant before you finally pulled the trigger? Tell me your horror stories in the comments below. Landlords, I know that some of these things seem pretty simple, but the key isn't a matter of the complexity of the tasks that make for successful landlording. The key is being consistent with it and having a clear message for your tenants. Have you clearly established what a good tenant looks like in your mind? Have you prepared your tenant by explaining to them what you plan to do and how you mean to carry out the lease and what good lease practice is for them? Have you set yourself up knowing how to deliver good written notice and standing your ground when your tenant is in violation? By doing these things, you set yourself up for landlording success. Landlords, I hope that you are getting a ton of great information here. There's a ton of resources on this channel. I look forward to you checking all of them out. YouTube seems to think this video right here is the next best thing for you to watch. I invite you to check that out along with all the other content we have. And until next time, landlords, happy leasing.